welcome back once again. I barely need to say your name. The listeners are so familiar with your sonorous voice.
Oh, hopefully. It's the third time on here, I think. So
I think you've been on this podcast probably like 4 or 5 now at this point.
We had determinism, and then we had atheism versus religious writers, and the 2 Reliant K ones. Okay, I remember now.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And there was the mysterious unreleased episode from a previous podcast. Well, I'm trying to raise hype so we can sell it for a lot of money. Get people's minds going.
But no, it's great. It's great to be back on, honestly. The last few, I feel like we had a very productive conversation, and I had a lot of fun doing it, so I'm glad to be back.
Yeah, good. And this is the first YouTube edition of this podcast. So if the listeners weren't familiar with you already, you are now plastered on YouTube.
My face is all over the place, isn't it?
Yeah. Every Google search about Dostoevsky is just going to show you.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
So get ready for that level of fame. But welcome back. We are here to talk about Dostoevsky today. And it is in reaction to the episode on the Weekly Intellectual about Dostoevsky. So I'd love to just first get some of your background with the Russian author. And let's take it from there.
Yeah, so I first heard of him when I was starting to read about the existentialists. Friedrich Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Sartre, and obviously Dostoevsky. And I started reading Crime and Punishment because I really wanted to get into some of the classics. It was when I first started reading, really reading. And I really wanted to get into those classics. And the one that I always used to remember on the shelves and what people would talk about is Crime and Punishment. I had no idea what it was. I didn't even know it was a Russian book. I thought it was an American book. But I got into that, and honestly, it was so hard for me to get into the book at the time. I think I was 15, 16. And originally, I thought it might have just been a bad translation. But I think there's something very distinctive about the way that Russian culture, how people act in Russian culture, and just this very subtle way of expressing underlying meaning, like a subtext kind of. And something that I just could not comprehend the first time I read it. I've hence read that book or listened to the audio book a couple more times, and it's opened up to me more.
Yeah.
But what was your experience reading his stuff for the first time?
Yeah, I'd say it was similar. I tend to feel with a lot of his books actually that until the end, when everything ties up, I can't connect points of the story into a coherent narrative until the end, and then I'm pretty satisfied, which is why I've enjoyed his books and kept reading different books of his.
That is a good point.
So I feel like there's that arc for me as I'm reading those books, and that's definitely how it was with Crime and Punishment. And it reminds me of we had like a reading club for a little bit. It might still continue. If those who are in that reading club hear this, I haven't given up hope on its continuance. But
he misses you.
Yeah. Please write. No. But there's a girl who is from an Eastern European country, and she was commenting on how Dostoevsky, we're talking about Brothers Karamazov, and we'll get to that later, I'm sure, but she was saying how his writing very much reflects the Eastern mindset and the Russian mindset of more collective, more kind of like societally bound and less individualistic. But that makes it interesting because he does dive so far deep into the individual and into the individual psyche. With that being said, I think it's an acquired ear or an acquired mind to understand his writing, because it is very different than your typical, even your typical author from that time.
I read people like Victor Hugo, a French author, and it's extremely accessible to me.
Yeah.
I think there's something so distinct about the Russian culture and the feel of it. It's so much different than so many of the other European countries. I don't know if that's because of this land mass and just the diversity of people that are in the country, but it's very intriguing when you're reading these books and you feel like you're really getting an experience into daily life, which is interesting when we talk about existentialism, because that's a lot of what it's about, is everyday life and how people really feel and think and face the kind of environment that we actually interact with all its grossness and at times drudgery. You said in your podcast that great books are worth trudging through, worth working through and really laboring through these long parts that you wouldn't necessarily want to read to get to that culmination.
Yeah, the culmination, also just like little gold nuggets of insight. In Dostoevsky's case, insights into the human condition, I think, is what he is an expert at. Which, again, we'll get to the Brothers Karamazov, I'm sure, but just like I think the greatest example for me in his writing, in my own personal interpretation, obviously, is the lawyer's speech at the end of the Brothers Karamazov, and I would encourage people to read that book for that reason alone, to get to that part, because it was incredibly satisfying to me as I read it. I don't know if you had a similar experience with that one, but that's like the best example to me of like you get through 700 some pages, and that particular passage, again, for me, like kind of made the book worthwhile.
My part in that specific book might have been Ivan and the Devil, but
yeah. Some others would say the Grand Inquisitor.
Well, the Grand Inquisitor is kind of in the middle, which it is amazing, and like you said, a lot of people think it's one of the best things in literature, period. And to be honest, I don't think I understand it. I have a surface level understanding of what he's trying to say, the hypocrisy in the church and all of the repression that goes on, but I feel like there's some deeper meaning in there, and I've read it through so many times, just that section, and that's honestly probably the best reason I can think that it is great, is because you can really feel when you're missing something.
Yeah.
You know, like you can really feel that, and I get that with the Grand Inquisitor. I feel like I'm just totally missing something, and I haven't been able to find it yet.
Yeah.
Maybe you can tell me.
No. my experience with that passage, and honestly, I don't think I've done my due diligence on it, because when I was reading through the Brothers Karamazov, I got to the end of the Grand Inquisitor of that section, and thought, oh wait, that was it? Like, that was the passage that I heard so much about before the book?
You kind of get,
And I almost, like, I had to go back and see, like, oh, that was supposed to be Jesus? Like, the guy in the story, that's, like, Jesus himself? And, it's interesting. But so far, that one has not struck home as much for me either, that passage. But, but let's rewind just a little bit, and you were saying that you first read Crime and Punishment, and you felt like it was maybe not the best translation, but do you feel like as you continue to read his books that you did get more of a feel for that rhythm, that cadence of his particular writing?
Yeah, I do, and it's one of the largest things is when to be able to identify sarcasm. Because I feel like his writing style is very sort of sarcastic in some ways. Just like when you're reading Plato's dialogues, it's hard to really understand Socratic irony, and it messes you up if you don't know those things. If you don't know someone's joking, and you get that a lot in Dostoevsky. But I have been able to understand it more as I read him more, and also as I age. Because I have a better ear for it. I think it's kind of a result of getting a little older and getting a little jaded. you don't necessarily think people are always authentic with what they're saying.
Mm.
And something like the brothers Karamazov, you almost have to assume that their father's being cruelly sarcastic with everything he says.
Yeah, that's the example I thought of when you were saying that. It's like the father, is just like talking out of his butt the whole time.
Yeah.
But other characters are more difficult to catch on to.
Ivan is very cryptic, and and Ilyosha is pretty straightforward. But in Crime and Punishment, he's, like I said, I think of it as kind of a stream of consciousness book. It might not be that in actual... I've never read a stream of consciousness book like James Joyce, but I think that's why that one's so cryptic. Just because you're getting an insight into the chaos of his mind.
Mm. Yeah, in Crime and Punishment, you mean?
Right. What did I say?
I didn't know if you're talking about Ulysses by James Joyce at that point. Right. But I was going to say about Ulysses quickly, that definitely is like stream of consciousness throughout the entire novel. Mm-hmm. And I got about 100 pages into that book and decided now's not the time for me to read this because I couldn't track it. I couldn't follow what was happening. Yeah. And that book follows a man's thoughts completely uncensored through the course of a day. Mm-hmm. But it's like an epic, like it's supposed to be like a modern day Iliad.
Oh, okay.
And so, Odyssey. I believe. I think it's the Odyssey. But yeah, so I think it is related to that. Crime and Punishment is related to that in that you are getting the uncensored, unfiltered thoughts of someone who is getting more and more unstable through the course of the book. And not to give any spoilers to those who haven't read it, but that's part of his punishment, is that he's becoming less and less stable. And you are getting a feel for that through the book.
If they didn't read the books after your caution in the Weekly Intellectual, then it's too late now.
Yeah. Well, for any casual YouTube passersby.
I also wanted to talk about just at the beginning here, if you don't mind, just going through his biography a little bit. When he was 18, his mother died. Well, he grew up in a pretty rich family, right? So he grew up in an affluent family, and then at 18, his mother died, and then and
his father died a few years before that.
His father died before his mother?
Mm-hmm. Yep. His father, if I remember correctly, his father was possibly murdered.
Because didn't he write that letter to his brother? When would he have written that letter to his brother? Because you said that was days after his father died, right?
Yeah, I think, like a month after his father died, but I think... I might be completely wrong, but I thought that his mother lived a few more years after that.
Oh, okay.
But you think his mother died first?
I think so, because the way that I've heard it, he had enough time to reconcile with his father, because I've heard that his father was a very violent drunk, and he was very spiteful towards his father for a long time because of that. And then I heard that he reconciled with him before his father actually died.
Oh, okay.
So, I'm not sure which one it is, but... Yeah. I think you talked about how Sigmund Freud kind of interpreted Dostoevsky and put an Oedipal complex into that. I think it's interesting. It fits if you're a Freudian. His mother died at 18. He went on this radical streak, got in with the Young Turks in Russia, and started getting engaged in very leftist movements. And then got caught up with the Russian Secret Service under the Tsarist regime, and was convicted of that, and then was charged with death. At the moment of his execution, over a trench that they were going to shoot them and pile their bodies into, they excused him and instead sent him to Siberia for 10 years. I don't know what he did in Siberia. I would love to know his development when he was in Siberia. Do you know anything about that?
I think he was just working his butt off in the labor camp, wasn't he?
Being a Jean Valjean.
I think so. I mean, from what I've read, it was just very hard labor,
Well,
and that caused physical ailments for the rest of his life. I'm trying to remember of when I heard that his first epileptic fit was at the news of his father dying. And then I think the labor camps actually, like the labor camp made it a lot worse, his epileptic condition.
Well, that's just sad to think about, being in labor camps and then epilepsy on top of that.
Yeah. It's tough. It's probably like probably close to a Holocaust experience.
But I've also heard that a lot of affluent families in Russia weren't sent to work camps. They were just exiled. And I don't know with Dostoevsky if that was the case with him, but obviously it would have deepened his character and gave him a very wider perspective on what life looks like for different people. So I think after 10 years of that, you come back to a different person. He became an alcoholic, a gambler, had, you said, 2 wives. Did they die or did he divorce them?
I think so. He was married to his second wife until his death. The first one, I believe, was just a divorce, and like you said, he had a lot of issues. And his second wife especially supported him in like his writing ventures because he wasn't always a famous, well-paid author like Tolstoy, for instance. He was a lot more obscure, and so. My understanding is that his first marriage just had a lot of issues, somewhat his doing, and also obviously he had some outlying, unhelpful circumstances that he didn't cause, like being epileptic and going through a labor camp. All those things, I'm sure, added to hardship in his life. But
Yeah. But I wanted to get your perspective on what that movement throughout his life kind of did for him. Because he started out from 18 to 24, I think it's fair to assume that he was in his rebellious phase a little bit, going very, very liberal and doing things that were very progressive in the Russian culture. But then for some reason, after he got sent to Siberia and came back, he was very orthodox. He was very pious in his own way, I guess. But what kind of sparked that in him? What made him go back to his roots as a Russian?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think that seems to be a fairly ubiquitous question for at least a lot of people, that they are liberal when young and more conservative when older.
Well, I've heard a quote that I'm not going to say if I agree with it or not, but I've heard a quote that says, if you're not a liberal by the time you're 20, you have no heart. If you're not a conservative by the time you're 40, you have no mind.
Yeah, Winston Churchill, right?
Is that Winston Churchill?
I think so.
It sounds like something you'd say, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm trying to, there's a lot that could be said for that, I think, but I think part of that is when you're young, the desire to explore all that is out there, and you feel constrained in your life experience, and you want to see what else there is to offer, and you might get caught up being, young and dumb. You might get caught up in a revolutionary's ideas or an extremist's ideas and say, let's do it. Let's throw all this out the window and start our own society or start our own revolution. And then I think, kind of like you mentioned earlier about just like being beat down. I think being beat down causes people to look back at why their ancestors or why the people before them, even their parents, did the things that they did, and they say, oh, that actually makes sense, having some kind of foundation, having some kind of bearings to go off of, and the shared history, whether it be religion or government or other societal factors. But I think for Dostoevsky in particular, specifically, the experience of having his life flash before his eyes, in a sense, in that moment before execution, and then being pardoned, was big in his development. He said at one point, and I don't exactly remember where, but he said that that is one of the worst experiences a human can endure, is to think that they are on the verge of death and then to be released. And I think he cited it as like a form of mockery, to dangle his life before him and then say, just kidding, you can go, you're good.
That was scamp.
Yeah, that was so like off-putting to him. For his life.
Well, you also think about what kind of commitments and states of mind you go through in preparation the moments before that thing is going to happen, if you're sure you're going to die. And then you like Martin Luther in the thunderstorm, it's said that he committed his life to God at that point because he thought he might die. If Dostoevsky saw his life flash before his eyes and he got all these convictions about what he wanted life to be like and what he actually believes, knowing he's going to die and then doesn't die, is that kind of writing up a contract for the rest of your life to live up to how you felt in that moment?
Potentially, yeah, that's very interesting. And I mean, I think there are countless examples of deathbed conversions, of people coming to the edge of that precipice and saying like...
Conversion in a very broad sense.
Yeah, well, I mean, like Constantine is a good example. Converted,
he was baptized on his deathbed. Yeah.
Yeah, kind of like committed himself fully to the cause at his deathbed. I had a roommate once who said he was pretty staunchly atheist, and he came from a religious background, and he said that he even convinced his parents against religion, that they all became non-religious at a later point when he went to college and came back and told them these things. And he said, yeah, I don't have the slightest inkling toward belief in a higher power at this point. And he said, I'll be honest, I think when I get closer to my deathbed, I might be inclined to reconsider. But right now, with my full wits about me, I'm atheist. And I found that interesting, and that kind of speaks to that point of, at death you might think, or near death you might think differently about the grand scheme.
Yeah. So what do you think Dostoevsky's, what are some interesting points of view that you think come from Dostoevsky's theology?
He speaks to the absurdity of life in his theology.
Yeah.
I think that you mentioned Sartre earlier, and Camus, Albert Camus could be thrown in there also, in that camp of both of those later mid-20th century thinkers talked about the absurdity of life.
Well, Camus, yeah, more so Camus, but yeah, definitely Sartre too.
Yeah, and so them being disciples or forebears of the existential movement, I think kind of fleshed that idea out. But in Dostoevsky, I think it's intellectually honest, and also just honest in the sense of these are not the things that we would choose for ourselves. This is not how we would choose for life to be, reality to be, but this is how it is. So we need to accept that and then come to some idea of whether we believe in God or not, whether we believe that this world has meaning or not. But here are the cold facts about it. And in commentary about Brothers Karamazov, for instance, and I might have mentioned this in the other podcast earlier also, but one of the commentators said, Dostoevsky wrestles with the question, does God exist? And he comes to the ultimate conclusion of, yes, he does. But what are, and that is after some of the harshest, most,
scathing.
Yeah, the most scathing reviews of Christianity in that book before he comes to the conclusion of, yes, God exists, yes, there is meaning. And then, when I read that commentary, even after reading the book, I thought, but does he? Does he actually say that? Or is he more saying, here are both sides of the argument and take it as you will, kind of thing? Because I don't think he's so bold to say that he knew for sure. I think he more so says, there's a good argument for it. And like you said, he seems to be very pious in a sense, but also speaks to someone like Nietzsche, He was very anti-religious. But Nietzsche said that Dostoevsky, for him, was the greatest gift of his life.
Are you saying he might be using, in a way, a Pascal's wager type of...
Potentially, and I've thought of that wager in our conversation already, like with the near-death experience, hedging your bets in a sense of what might come next. Yeah. But maybe not quite that explicit.
Yeah, I think it's not quite there, but
can I say a quick side note about Pascal's wager?
Yes.
I think a lot of people are very critical of it and say like that's a bunch of garbage, you can't force yourself into belief. But that was one of 6 or 7 wagers that he proposed in Penseus, which is thoughts. It's translated thoughts, and it was a notebook that they found posthumously. He didn't even mean for it to be. He didn't. What do you call it? Not produce. He didn't have it published in his lifetime.
Okay, yeah.
So that's an interesting side commentary on the wager.
Him and Nietzsche getting shafted. Just jeez.
Well, I think even Pascal was very prominent in his lifetime.
Yeah.
But he chose for those thoughts, they're basically his personal musings, to not be published.
Right.
So anyway, but
yeah,
back to that.
So in Brothers Karamazov, the whole beginning of the story is kind of centered around Ilyusha in this monastery, right? And it's so interesting how Dostoevsky presents these monks and their societal structure, the way they interact with each other, and the way that the masses of these gathering towns kind of influence how the monasteries do their bureaucratical back and forth, and then also how they're perceived as spiritual entities. I remember in one part of the beginning, Father Zosima dies, and they're looking for a miracle because saints produce miracles when they're dead. And Dostoevsky moves into this beautiful representation of disillusionment and also like some mob mentality about how there wasn't a miracle, he must not have been a saint, and the superstition. And he's almost, at the time it was probably very cutting to critique superstition in that kind of way.
Yeah, and I think I hadn't thought of it in this light when I was reading it, but as you were bringing it back up now, I just thought, how much of those stories do you think were embellished after the fact? Like,
Are they supposed to be true stories?
Well, they were presented as true stories, and Alyosha took them as literal. So he himself was very disturbed at the miracles not occurring.
Sorry. We're in like 3 levels here. You're saying that in the story they're supposed to be true, not that they were literally true stories.
Right, yeah.
Okay.
In, like, presented to Alyosha in the story, they were literal accounts.
That is one of the beautiful things about the book and the way that Dostoevsky presents the characters, because Ilyusha is getting it through the successor, right? The successor that's going to be the head of this monastery. He's a very like dour, serious monk. So yeah, he might be getting a skewed story. That's true.
Yeah, well, I'm just thinking like more broadly even about when we, like, a great hero will live in a people's lifetime, and then that generation passes on and tells stories of that hero to the next generation.
Napoleon.
And it could get more and more embellished as time goes on, potentially, which is, I mean...
well, especially with saints. I mean,
yeah. Well, that goes back to the even the most broad religious questions of how much are religious figureheads embellished through time. And I think that's why we have such an emphasis nowadays on original documents.
Well, if St. Patrick wouldn't have gotten all those snakes out, then the Irish would be in a whole heap of trouble. So
have more than the potato famine to worry about.
Oh yeah,
snakes on top of it. Snakes on a plane on steroids. whole country
with 16 packs.
Yeah. So anyway, you were saying it's a beautiful rendition of disillusionment, of Alyosha being kind of taken down from his innocent, pure belief to something a little more hardened and adult.
Yeah, at least understanding that these monks are not... They're people. They're people just like everyone else. And maybe before that point he saw them as sainted and set apart. He realizes that they can be fickle and they can be conniving. They can be really concerned about personal status and the way people think about them.
Yeah.
Isn't there one monk that's like a very ascetic type of guy, and he lives in a hut outside of the grounds and just doesn't speak and only eats little portions? And I think Dostoevsky really asks the reader in all those interactions if he's doing it for self-satisfaction or status. I think he comes to the conclusion eventually that it's authentic, but...
Meaning that very ascetic monk.
Yeah, that ascetic monk is just like starving himself to be some type of living martyr.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and I think that has been a question throughout the history of monkhood and nunnery, is what are they really doing it for? And I think they would tell you through a lot of history, we are doing it because we are denying this life for the cause of the next life and to inspire others to do the same. And I do think there's like there have been authentic people in that to a degree, but then you think about like how much in the human condition can you actually be selfless? Like how much is that possible?
And what does it mean? And and
yeah.
But there's definitely different. I mean, at least in the Catholic Church, there's the Benedictines, there's the Augustinians, there's the Franciscans that are all centered around a different need in the church or a different cause. The Franciscans are very, very loving and accepting. The Augustinians are very liturgical. But
I think it was the Dominicans who said, "Think about your death each day. Keep it before your eyes."
Yeah. I
like that.
I
like to think about death. It's nice.
Love it.
No, but I was going to say, too, Martin Luther, we mentioned Martin Luther already.
Yeah.
He lived that ascetic life for a while. He was also a flagellate for a while in his life. If not explicitly, at least, he did whip himself, do those self-flagellating acts to try to become right with God. But in the isolation part of his journey, he came to the point of saying, yes, that's a good way to live, and yes, it's good to, deny the pleasures of this life for a greater purpose, but we also need to be in the world to make a positive change in the world. We can't be totally separate, or no one will be affected by good deeds or actions. So
you can't connect with anyone if you're an alien, and I don't think we're put here to just lay down and starve ourselves until we die. So
why are we put here, Eli?
Put here to interact with people and to help each other grow and realize what the heck we're doing here. We need to interact with each other and very intentionally live our lives in a way that other people can see it and know what not to do, what to do. So we need to be accessible.
Yeah.
But
yeah, that reminds me of, I think, some of the influence of Dostoevsky in my own life. And I think this was one of those moments where I thought I had an original idea, that my idea was brand new and I'd come across, like an unexplored epiphany. And then I read Dostoevsky and realized that I wasn't the first to think this.
When you're reading good writers, that tends to happen.
Yeah. And so the idea that I had was life is confusing and man struggles along, but that creates the hero in man is to continue that struggle and to move forward. And I think Dostoevsky, again, embodies that in his writing. I also think of someone like Kierkegaard. In The Sickness Unto Death, he said that the sickness unto death that Jesus referred to in the gospel accounts is despair. And so the worst point a human being can be at is total despair. and the struggle is to stay away from despair. If you are anywhere on the other side of the spectrum, you're doing okay.
Would you... despair is not synonymous at all with apathy, is it? Because
I think
so like Sheol and Hades, like in the Odyssey, Hades is kind of described as a place where people are just in kind of a constant state of apathy, right? They're kind of wandering around, not exactly sure what they're doing. They're kind of foggy-minded. And the way that they talk about Sheol, it kind of seems that way. But despair is almost like caring, like you still care. And there's a part in in Dark Knight Rises, in Batman, you know, the part where Bane says, like, there is no true despair without hope. And then in...
Is that right before he breaks Batman's back?
Or I think it's when he brings him to the prison, but then in...
you see the light from the top of the prison, and you try to get there.
It's in the commercial, so... and then in Dante, the sign above hell is abandon hope all who enter here. And there's some conversation, probably a long conversation about what that actually means, but hope and despair are two things that are very interesting to think about together, because I think when you get to the point of apathy, it's just you don't care enough to be in despair.
Right, and I think at dark moments of people's lives, you can make a choice between which is more painful, despair or apathy. Because if you are not to the point of despairing, I think true despair, and I'm not trying to be insensitive here, but I think true despair in action has to be suicide at its most extreme.
Or apathy. Well, apathy probably wouldn't be. Right. Apathy wouldn't be because you wouldn't want to take action, but...
Yeah, and apathy, exactly. Apathy is the sense of things are terrible, this is horrible, but I am numb. Yeah, I don't care.
This or that, whichever.
Yeah, I will take no action in response to this.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Speaking of that, are we spoiler alert, and you want to stay away from those?
For Dostoevsky?
Right.
No, like you said, if people haven't read it by now, they can...
Too late.
They can pause it, or they can pause it and read all his books, or they can just accept it.
So, at the end of the book...
I was going to say, sorry, super quick. I think in the other episode I said I'm going to reveal enough to inspire people to read it, but yeah, this is the deep, in-depth commentary. So, this is only for the serious Dostoevsky fans. Go ahead.
At the end of Brothers K, the servant that actually killed the father gives this long speech to Yvonne. And Yvonne's confused because he's like, I didn't tell you to kill my father. What are you talking about? And the servant says, you knew I was going to do it. You didn't stop me. And then he kills himself after that. I'm so confused. If you remember it, I'd love to get your opinion on what happened in between that. He sounded so confident. Was it Yvonne's denigration of him? Because he thought Yvonne was going to be proud of him? Because Yvonne was inspiring to him through his speeches about nihilism and atheism?
Yeah. If I remember correctly, that scene comes right after Yvonne's struggle with the devil, right?
Yeah.
So I almost wonder, was that servant also fighting with the devil in his own way, and came across to Yvonne as that confident, you told me to do this, it's justified kind of way, but struggling very much internally. And I think that could be a commentary on, potentially, if that is the case, it could be a commentary on what we experience internally versus what we express to other human beings who are not in our minds. So that's one idea. And then the other thing I think of when you ask that question is, was Yvonne understanding him correctly if he was so troubled at that time? Because he almost seems to be, that servant in that moment almost seems to be non-human in what he's saying. He almost seems like a demon.
Yeah.
Like he's like, yeah, I killed him. I feel no remorse. You told me to do it.
And he seems arrogant, which makes me so surprised that he ends up suiciding himself. It's like, you were just arrogant a second ago and seemed so confident, at least the way that I read it.
Yeah.
So,
yeah,
it's a weird turn of events.
Right. Yeah, and I think, so Brothers Karamazov, I think especially deals with archetypes in the way that he paints these characters that are the extreme of some characteristic.
Can you kind of go over that real quick?
Yeah, what an archetype is?
No, just what characters you think express certain themes or archetypical characteristics.
Yeah, so I think Yvonne is the archetypal intellectual of Dostoevsky's time.
The disillusioned intellectual.
Yeah, the one who feels like he has a solid grasp on his own reality, and then might be humbled in that, but might also just be so charismatic and so able in his arguments.
Does Yvonne kind of remind you of Sam Harris? I've been listening to a lot of Making Sense. So
yeah, no, I love that podcast. I think it's amazing.
Yeah, I've listened to almost every episode.
Really? Wow. Dang.
Yeah, I love it.
That's the one podcast I pay for.
I really wanted to, because his argument against advertisements is so noble. I think.
Yeah.
Honestly, it is noble is a good word for it.
And he will give it free to those who have any reason to need it.
That's inspiring.
Yeah.
Regardless of whatever else you think about him, that aspect is very inspiring.
Sorry, super quick side trail on that. Did you listen to his most recent episode about these protests?
Yeah.
I really didn't like that. It was highly unsettling to me. But I would recommend his podcast to almost anybody who can handle a different worldview. But anyway, so yeah. So I think what you're saying is, shout out to Sam Harris for being a solid podcaster and thinker, but does Yvonne remind me of him? Yeah,
It was kind of off the cuff question, but...
Yeah, well, I'm trying to think, I wonder if Sam Harris will ever get to the point that Yvonne got to in the book.
He seems far too stable for me, but...
Yeah. Because I think Dostoevsky kind of caricatures that and says, if a highly intellectual person who's very sure of there being no God, in that case, were to come to the bitter end of those conclusions, what would it look like?
So, it's interesting because he doesn't come to the bitter end of the conclusions. He sees someone else do it because of what he said.
Right. And that's the only reason he's forced to really examine it. Right?
Yeah. And isn't that interesting, because can that cut to you a lot worse when you see someone else suffer from your own ideas, if they do turn out to be deleterious to human sanity?
Well, and that's honestly what I've... Right, we're going to talk about Sam Harris a little bit. That's honestly what I've thought about his arguments. I've thought he is a very stable person. He is a highly intellectual person. But I think other people have even given this criticism to say, what if someone's not as stable as you and takes your ideas into their life? Are they going to be better for it? I think he represents a thought-out, peaceable, well-mannered atheist, but is somebody who's more militant or angrier or more bitter going to have a much worse outcome. And I think that goes to the idea that teachers will be held doubly accountable to some extent, because they're not just living a life for themselves and making errors where they will. They can also be influential to others who carry out those ideas to better or worse ends.
Well, it depends on... Every writing class I've ever taken has said two things to me fundamentally. One, you trust your audience, and two, you show and do not tell. I think if he were to be more cautious about what he's saying, he wouldn't be trusting his audience to make their own decisions about things. And
Well, he
if,
says-
if people aren't worthy of what he sees as an honest interpretation, then
But doesn't he say outrightly we must do away with religion?
Yeah.
So I don't know if, I mean, that's not leaving much room for interpretation.
well, hopefully people can read about religion on their own time and see if they agree with that. Hopefully they don't respect him and worship him to the point where they just take his word as fact. But
Yeah.
who knows? Who knows if that's giving people too much credit? But I think it's the only option.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So
Then you start telling people that masks aren't effective.
did he say that?
No, they were telling everybody that masks weren't effective for a long time, and they blatantly said that was. Well, but
They probably didn't apologize for it though. They're just like, actually, masks are effective.
Anthony Fauci flat out said that we wanted the supply of masks to be ready for the medical workers. So we lied so that they would be able to use them in the hospitals, which good cause, means to an end. Yeah.
You can wonder the same thing about the Epstein deal. Was it for a better cause that they made a bad deal with him because it outed a lot of other bad people?
If it is true that it would have outed a lot of people in serious structural positions,
Yeah, which could be good for
Then-
society.
it could be very, very damaging to society. It would fracture the whole trust system in our governing authorities. But
Well, we shouldn't trust shoddy people, though.
if we find out that they're shoddy,
Wouldn't it be better to know?
but if the noble lie, there are certain noble lies that may be justified. They're very crazy things, but
I don't think I agree with that. You're talking about Plato, right? The noble lie?
so you're saying a government should always be honest with its people.
Ideally. All right.
I think there's certain things in warfare and in reconnaissance and intelligence gathering that we cannot know about just within the nature of what they're doing.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, it might cause you to not do your everyday job if you knew some of the deep, dark
Or
secrets.
just people knowing about it would destroy the whole point of the thing.
And the founding fathers definitely had the view that the common man was not to be fully trusted. With
That's
every
why
bit of
we are
information.
a democratic republic
Yeah.
federation instead of a pure democracy.
Right.
But
Yeah. All right, so, yeah. That's good. I like that.
I hated it.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll edit it out then. You won't hear it, I promise. No, but... so, yeah, the archetypes in Brothers Karamazov.
Mhm.
I think Ivan is the archetypal intellectual. I think Alyosha is the archetypal pure, innocent faith holder.
Okay, it's gonna sound sexual for people, but virgin. That's like in the archetypical perspective of virgin or virginal innocence. Like, it goes beyond sex.
Unblemished by the world.
Yeah, it goes beyond sex, but like that's the word that comes to my mind when I think of Ilyusha.
Yeah. Like yet unstained.
Yeah.
Yeah.
By knowledge and corruption.
Yeah, it reminds me of Mumford and Sons line. You will lose your innocence, but not your substance. So you can still hold on to substance, but everyone eventually loses innocence to some degree. And the Alyosha does in the book. But their father, I think, is the archetypal scumbag. I think Dostoevsky is trying to communicate, don't be like this person. Do not do the things that he does. And honestly, sorry, I just watched the Epstein documentary on Netflix today, which is why it's on my mind, but I think Epstein represents archetypal lust for a modern example. He did everything he possibly could to satisfy his desire for sexual pleasure. Because you think, why does a billionaire do all that knowing you're going to be caught eventually in some form or fashion. Maybe he just thought he would never actually, be indicted, but yeah, it's just mind-boggling how he does all these things that his rap sheet is huge. Why would a billionaire go to those lengths to danger himself?
The sexual aspect was just a branch off of the ego. That's just one way he satisfies his ego. Another way is holding things over the heads of powerful people.
Yeah. So, other archetypes. I think Zosima, Father Zosima, is like the archetypal good monk.
The Gandalf.
Yeah, he's the example of, yes, you can abuse the monastery and have ill-intended gains for yourself by living that life, but he's the example of somebody who's actually aiming to be selfless. Those are the ones that come to mind first. Can you think of any others, or do you have other ideas about those?
The servant is kind of like a conniving trickster. Trickster would be kind of an archetypical model. And yeah, I think the servant, I can't remember his name. Do you remember his name?
I don't. But he was somehow the father's son also.
Yeah, he was the bastard son of their father.
Yeah.
And yeah, he's the trickster though.
He's also epileptic, right?
He's faking it, from what I understand.
I just find it really interesting how Dostoevsky includes an epileptic character in most of his stories.
Because that's how he got away with murdering the father.
Oh yeah,
he faked a seizure.
He at least faked that one seizure.
True, he might have had it and then just faked that one. Yeah. But some other models. There's the girl.
Oh, Grushenka.
Grushenka, she's the siren.
Yeah.
There's two girls. There's Grushenka, and then there's the kind of more noble, modest one.
Who is that? The fiance of Dmitri originally.
Yeah, and she's she's like the boring, modest one.
Yeah.
And then Grushenka is the siren who's trying to lure Dmitri's ship away, and also their father, and then also tries to get some weird sexual tension going with Ilyusha.
Just to try to undo his goodness.
Kind of creepy. Sense, right? Yeah, it was every time they interacted, it was so creepy, but
yeah.
I don't know what her aim was.
Yeah, I was going to say too about that. Do you know that Brothers Karamazov is going to be a trilogy?
Yeah, I heard that in your podcast. I didn't know that.
So, I think it's amazing as a standalone book, especially because it touches on all those archetypes. But it just makes you wonder, what was he going to do next with that story?
Well, Dmitri...
I guess it left on a cliffhanger a bit.
Yeah, a little bit, because you don't know what's going to happen with Dmitri. And Vaughn, I think, kind of recomposes himself a little bit towards the end.
Yeah, gains his footing again.
Yeah, I don't know where he would have taken it, I guess. It would have been a world-spanning adventure. It might have even gone to America. Named their kid Feifel. You ever see Feifel Goes West?
No.
Great American Tale.
That's an animated movie, right?
It's like a mouse movie where the Russian mice come over to America.
Oh, geez, that's trouble.
An American Tale. Feifel Goes West is something else.
Okay.
Whatever. What are some other interesting things that you think of when you think of Dostoevsky?
Yeah, gosh, I'm trying to think of the major books that I read. Crime and Punishment, Notes from Underground, Brothers Karamazov, The Idiot. I think there's one other that I mentioned in the podcast.
He also has a book called Demons, which is about a young, kind of innocent person, a little bit like the Idiot. Like I said in the last podcast, I talked about this. I couldn't think of the name. It's Demons. Or Devils. And it's about a young person who gets caught up in this radical leftist movement under a charismatic leader who convinces the members of his group that there's this master uprising going on in Russia, and that they need to take care of their own sect, their own little position, and then eventually they'll branch out and connect with this larger group. Turns out there's no larger group. He's just this charismatic leader lying to these people, and he gets taken in. And it's about his disillusionment with that type of radical thinking, and then his eventual corruption, and he does some terrible things. But I think it's interesting because Dostoevsky is so autobiographical in his writing sometimes. Like you were talking about, including a character in each book that has epilepsy. And with the challenges that come along with that, he also has an experience from his own youth about his dipping his toe into radicalism, and I guess it was more than dipping his toe, he got convicted. So.
Yeah. I'm not very familiar with that one. Do you know at what point in his life he wrote that, or like what stage in the novel process?
It was his third major novel, if I'm remembering right.
So probably after Crime and Punishment.
Yeah, it was after Crime and Punishment. It was right before Brothers Karamazov.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, I'll have to look into that one because it's probably very developed at that point in his thinking.
It's very interesting because they said when he wrote it, it became an instant bestseller in Russia. But then the first Russian Revolution came about, and the regime that was in power took it off the shelves.
So maybe like undermined their authority.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. I was just going to touch on The Idiot for a second. I think that it's interesting to see like who his epileptic characters are, because I think it matters, because in some form or fashion that relates to his own identity, because I think he described his epileptic experiences as very spiritual and very otherworldly, and that's how epilepsy has been understood historically, as having some kind of spiritual value, and that those are often like seers in other cultures or shamans, because they have this ability to touch the other world or the other reality during these fits or right before. And the way Dostoevsky described it was that he would be on the verge of some grand epiphany or some grand understanding that he never had before, and then the epileptic fit would hit, and he would lose it, and he'd just have the seizure. So I think there's a reason why he picks the characters he does to be epileptic, but in The Idiot, and it's also interesting who he chooses to be his good protagonist, because I think in The Idiot, that character, I can't pinpoint his name at the moment, but it's essentially a Jesus for Dostoevsky's time. It was like Jesus is dropped in Russia, basically. But he's very similar to Alyosha. He's good, he's innocent, he's thought to be pretty clueless about culture and society. Prince Mishkin. Okay. Yeah, that's the one. But then that he kind of flips that perspective in Brothers Karamazov, and Alyosha is very likable. The Idiot is just thought to be dumb, and no one appreciates him or understands him. And then in Brothers Karamazov, Alyosha is kind of thought to be simple, but also very virtuous. People appreciate him more.
So what are some of the things that Mishkin does that people form this perception of him?
I think when we were talking about sarcasm earlier, people are sarcastic in The Idiot. They're like, there's a bunch of like cocktail parties, like the elite class is getting together to hang out, and there's like...
Sorry, one second. Those were the most confusing parts of Brothers Karamazov for me. Those dinner parties.
Yeah.
They're so confusing. But yeah, go on.
Yeah, and so...
I must be an idiot.
Well, yeah, and in The Idiot, like, people say something, and Mishkin takes it very literally. Like, someone's like, oh, did you have a good time at the ball with so-and-so, you rascal? And he's like, yes, I did have a good time. Thank you. And things like that. And he's just very kind-hearted and good-natured, and never, like, attacking anyone, but I think that is seen as like unwitty.
Yeah.
Like, and that's what's valued in high society, is an ability to be witty and charismatic, and he's not those things. So, yeah, that kind of sticks out to me about Dostoevsky, is that particular book and that take on the Jesus figure.
I still haven't read The Idiot, and I've been meaning to for a long time, but can you kind of explain The Idiot and kind of how his journey goes? Does he end up getting understood by people? It's not going to ruin it for me.
Yeah. Well, so
unless you feel very confident that you don't want to screw something up for me.
I don't think so. I think it's kind of like the Jesus story in a sense. And obviously that's the allegory that he's creating with this character. But it's like the Jesus story in that you kind of know the outcome, but it's still useful to read it to understand the details of it. But basically he's from another land. I think he's from another country. He comes to Russia because he...
Wasn't he in a sanatorium?
Yes, before coming to Russia. I think... And that was like a misunderstanding even. He wasn't necessarily supposed to be...
He didn't understand sarcasm, so they're like, to the asylum with you.
I think he's just like so... The premise of the book is basically, can someone be pure and good in our modern world? And I think the reason he ended up in a sanatorium is because, no, you cannot really get along with people if you are pure and good. And that's basically the narrative of the book. That's the arc, is that all throughout he's misunderstood. At the end of the story, the reason it's called The Idiot, they're basically just like, yeah, we don't want to mess with this guy. Like, we don't like him. We're not going to put on airs. And I think a big part of the reason why they don't like him is that he reflects to them their own nastiness. When they are nasty to him and he just repays them with kindness, it's like in the Bible talks about heaping coals on someone's head, hot coals, with a kind word. I think that's what they get from from Mishkin, without his intending so, even because he's just that like obliviously kind-hearted.
Aren't you just so pure?
Yeah, exactly. And so they take offense to that. And I think it's too a take on the idea of the Pharisees in the biblical story. The Pharisees are vilified nowadays and say like, oh, how could they possibly be that perverse? And I think Dostoevsky writes The Idiot with the idea of, we would be Pharisees too if Jesus was popped into our modern day culture and world.
I'm trying to think in my own life if there's been someone like that. I was about to say I'm not going to name drop, but
I didn't use last name. Is that relevant?
Yeah, Mike was a real idiot. No, I don't remember who you're talking about, but
really?
But yeah, but I don't think I want you to remind me right now because I don't want to call anyone out.
I was gonna say first initial, last name.
Let's see. But no, I can't. I don't know how I would react to that. I might think they were holier than thou. It might come off as something that's pretentious or.
Yeah, you might think they're inauthentic if they're actually very good. They don't have the human traits of...
I read an article once that said that a lot of the reason people swear is to create some camaraderie in a group. It's a taboo that people gather around to signal some type of group inclusion. And I think that there's a lot of taboos. Augustine talks about how he talks about in the Confessions when he was a child. This one time when they were walking around the city and just picking fruit off of privately owned trees and just throwing the fruit on the ground. And he said that was irredeemable because it was chaotic and anarchic, and there was no reason for it. They just wanted to destroy something. But he comes back to it a little later and says maybe the redeemable force in that was the desire to be included in a group and to have friends that you're doing something with.
Right.
So someone that's that pure wouldn't do something like that. You know?
Yeah.
So I could see that happening.
Yeah, well, we are at about an hour 5, and we should maybe wrap it up because it sounds like there's some dogs maybe about to stampede through here. Yeah, thanks for another good conversation and for stimulating further thought about this topic and about Dostoevsky.
Yeah.
And I look forward to the next one.
Yeah, I do as well. Dostoevsky, and everyone needs to read him, obviously. I need to do a little more reading with Dostoevsky. I need to finish up the last few books that I've been putting on the back burner. But yeah, I hope we can do this again soon.
Yeah, you lend me demons and I'll lend you the idiot. How's that sound?
Sounds like a deal.
All right. Till then, we'll see you next time.
See ya.